Huples cat and Mr. Bear. Very snowy Mr. Bear, he doesn't like inclement weather. Walking him today might be a problem. So I did a very long video that I was going to put out on Friday, which was today I hope, and the video was entitled Angels and Fools. And my family, Kitty and her sister, here comes Becky, are very concerned that I might get fired from work, and I think it's a fairly legitimate concern. There is already nurses in America who have been fired for speaking out about the lack of PPE. A lot of the hospitals are responding to their incompetence in not providing PPE by threatening staff if they speak out or show themselves at work or outside of work wearing trash bags and improvised masks. The only point to that is not at all to protect the public from fear, right? It's to protect the incompetents who've allowed the situation to arise where the staff have not got the right PPE. Now, I use the word incompetence because it's pretty obvious to me that a lot of money, both private and public money, has been spent for over a decade on pandemic planning, and pretty much none of the governments, it seemed, actually stocked gowns, gloves and masks and hand sanitizer in anywhere near sufficient amounts to give restricted use to their healthcare services, whilst plans were already in place to supplement that from internal local areas, because obviously in a pandemic international trade's going to stop for a while. So yeah, they did not have that big picture thinking. It seemed pretty much everywhere. Now that's a generalization. I'm sure there are hospitals and health authorities that actually were ahead of this and realized in January what they needed to do and dealt with it. And I'm sure if you work for one of those health authorities, you feel pretty secure at work. Yeah, you're frightened. You can still catch COVID-19, even if you're wearing an N95 and goggles. It's still possible to catch it. It just makes it much more unlikely to catch it if you're actually wearing an N95 as opposed to nothing, or a surgical mask. So that's a real concern of mine. The silencing of nursing, the silencing of portering, whereas the voices that are speaking out, generally speaking, are medical, because society sees doctors as somehow privileged in both intellect and knowledge. And I'm seeing that, generally speaking, in the general population. Over and over, doctors who have a very limited and specialized field are speaking on the radio, speaking on TV, but I'm not hearing nurses speaking. And I hate to point this out to people, but nothing cures COVID-19 except time and the person's own body. A ventilator doesn't cure it, IVs don't cure it, certainly malaria drugs don't cure it, nor do HIV drugs cure it. They're looking at different things trying to fix it, but nothing cures COVID-19. What stops people from dying is good old-fashioned basic common sense and nursing care. So we've spent a lot of our focus in the West focusing on getting more and more ventilators, knowing that we have very few staff to use those ventilators with, and those staff are going to get hit in the early phase because of the lack of N95s. In SARS in 2003, we all wore N95s for the entire shift, and there was never a time ever where you thought, oh, I must reuse this, or I have to keep this on too long because I don't have a decent supply. Well, yeah, it was a few hospitals in the Greater Toronto area, and we had Canada and most of the United States to back us up, and they did. Whereas this one, we're all very much on our own. It's everywhere, it's global, it's a pandemic, not an endemic. So that's one of the interesting things for me, is that nurses are being silenced. The National Health Service is silencing its nurses in some of the trusts, literally threatening them. You must not speak to media. You cannot promote yourself as a nurse that works in my hospital. And I understand why you don't want to frighten the public. They don't want nurses literally wearing trash bags and scarves around their heads, which has not happened yet in the GTA, but has happened in various other places that have surged much more than we have. You don't want them there because the public might be frightened and not come to hospital and die. That's an excuse. It really is. And I'd like the politicians to take an active, firm stance on this. I'd like them to make it very clear that anybody in the healthcare system can speak out as long as they're not being specifically targeting other people. There's a difference between speaking out about shortages and plans than criticising individuals for incompetence on a personal level. That's an entirely different thing. And certainly there's been that, and there always is that in any situation where we're at war. So one of the things is that I'm going to put up a few slides from this and a few pictures from this. I had the long video. I'm not going to put it up because I say my family's concerned I'll get fired. I'm not particularly concerned. I do think that what I've said and what I'm doing and what I'm portraying is a fairly honest vlog about my personal experience going through this, and it's not specific to my hospital at all. This is everywhere. Everywhere's got the same sort of an issue. But one of the issues was that food from external sources, they suddenly decided couldn't be bought anymore. Somebody in the money generating foundation office decided that we can't accept food, we want to have gift certificates instead, so we can distribute them to the staff so they can have a good, well-deserved meal with their family once the emergency's over. So that addresses a few things. What it doesn't address the fact that some of those staff will be dead. Okay? So some of those staff that you're not going to allow food into the hospital for are going to be dead. Now they have a point. Restaurants could in fact infect people by contact. That is entirely possible. It's also true that staff are not being encouraged or asked to change footwear when they enter and leave the hospital. And a fair number of staff, I can guarantee, are going home, having worked actually on COVID units, and going home and walking those shoes they're wearing for 12-hour shifts into their own house. So I'm kind of concerned about that. But there's a whole bunch of different things related to this, and it turned out that as far as I could interpret it, we can accept food, we can buy our own food, we're just not allowed to share it unless it's in individual packets. So if people buy pizza, rather than throw it out, people should be wearing gloves and I guess a mask, a surgical mask, and they should be putting it into separate containers for the staff to eat. All very interesting stuff. So a few slides from that are going to come up and I'll show you them and I'll talk about them a little bit. The idea is, for me, is that this does multiple things. It actually gives the staff in some of the areas of the hospital that don't typically get food. For example, emerge ICUs quite often do get food deliveries, whereas a medical floor that's specialising in COVID rarely gets anything, especially in time of zero visiting. The other thing it does, it helps support financially local businesses in our local area, and we're dependent on those businesses for a lot of our food on the night shifts. The third thing it does, it allows members of the public in a directed way to actually support staff. Now the big fear, I'm guessing what they haven't said, is that they're worried there'll be too much stuff delivered. And that definitely happened. When we had a subway collision in our deepest part of our subway, quite a few years back now, it was in the middle of the summer, so much bottled water and pop was delivered for the emergency services personnel there that they had a huge problem removing it all. So people want to help. That goes back to my original point, is that I'd like the government of Canada, the government of Ontario, to set up local street by street committees, much like Neighbourhood Watch. In fact, even use that sort of a format and that existing thing. So people are surveying their own neighbours and finding out who's disabled, who's dependent on meds, who's a diabetic, who's elderly, who has no social supports, and have the neighbourhood right now, before we get a major surge, and hopefully we won't, but we probably will, the neighbourhood can actually help look after its elderly and its dependent and have a sense of unique community in that neighbourhood, because that's the sort of thing that will get us through this, not how many ventilators we have. Okay? Ventilators are very specific to do a very specific thing. We're not sure even how many of the COVID-19 patients that are ventilated will survive. It doesn't look great, I'll tell you that now. But what we do know is if we can keep people off the ventilators by good basic nursing care, the chance of survival appears to be quite good. And I'm talking about the critical area here. So, as we all know, 80% of the people who get it probably have mild to bad symptoms at home and are fine. About 20% will seek medical care. 3/4 of them probably actually needed to seek medical care. And out of them, between 2 and 5% of them will have serious ventilatory problems. That was what we were originally told. Now, it is kind of apparent that a majority or almost a majority of patients who seek medical care will actually require ventilation. So that's why we want the ventilators, but we need to have the staff. So the N95 is not the most precious resource of my hospital, as somebody told me the other day. The most precious resource is the staff behind the masks. They're absolutely vital. And there's a lot of fear and there's a lot of concern. And the hospital again is trying to do multiple things. So they sent out very clear messaging that caused a lot of problems. That messaging was removed by a doctor in an email, and I'm not sure where he is in the command structure of this. He tagged in a senior nurse. I'm not quite sure why doctors are now taking over. But basically, if you're doing an aerosol generating procedure like intubation, which we'll be doing a lot of in a surge scenario, you wear the mask for as long as possible. Makes sense. We don't have enough masks. We're using about 3,000 a day. We have about 6,000 a day we were using about 3 or 4 weeks ago. Before that we were probably using more. So we're really conserving, and we can't really conserve much more without actually really putting people at risk. So the idea that you put the mask on for the 12-hour shift, which is appealing to non-clinicians or clinicians who are so far out of clinical they don't understand clinical anymore. So again, why are they even in the decision-making process? I have to wonder. You can't do that. And you can't safely take off an N95 and put it in a paper bag and then reuse it. If you've done an aerosol generating procedure. If you've been shopping, of course you can. But it's very different when you're in a room with somebody intubating them in a lot of stress, whatever, or doing a code blue, or taking swabs, etc., and they're coughing. So yeah, that was rescinded. So they're keeping the N95 on, then they're taking it off properly and putting it in recycling bins. So they are starting now to recycle. It's a little bit of a pity that the recycling bins weren't put in place 4 weeks ago. Now, we had no plans and no ability to recycle 4 weeks ago. And certainly a lot of people in the command structure feel that they had no need and didn't know that they'd have to do this 4 weeks ago. So that again, it's vertical versus horizontal lines of communication in a stress situation. Certainly pretty much all the clinicians that I know 4 weeks ago knew that we were going to have a major shortage of N95 and would probably run out completely if we did not radically change both our using practices and how we obtain them. And how we obtain them, of course, has been a bit of a problem. So another 2 to 3 weeks I expect this to be up and running within 2 weeks, a full bore recycling process for the N95s. So that leaves the question, like I let my entire occupational health management team and other people know 3 weeks ago that when I used, or Kitty uses an N95, that we're safely putting it in a sealed plastic box, we're taking it home. And we are recycling it. I didn't go into specifics, they didn't ask. But now it came to me this week, and I haven't checked my email since, because quite frankly I have no interest in talking to people who aren't clinically based and understand the issues. Just because you have an MD or you're a certain position doesn't mean you understand the clinical issues. So they're concerned that I might be putting myself at risk, and they're quite right. I'd rather use a single-use N95 whenever I feel that I'm at risk from airborne contamination or direct droplet in a single room with people. And unfortunately we can't do that because we don't have enough N95, so what do? Do I just not wear an N95 and put a surgical mask on, knowing that the protection of the surgical mask is minimal in those circumstances? Or do I do what I'm doing and I recycle my masks and I use my masks if I need to, right? So that's one of the issues, is that unconventional methodology had to be done, and it had to be done really quickly to make us lean and nimble enough to deal with a crisis that's unprecedented in everybody's lifespan, except for people over the age of 100. Right? This is Spanish flu, and its impact is the same as Spanish flu. Whether the death toll will be 50 million, 100 million, or 2 million worldwide, yet to be determined. I'm not really still seeing why we can hold it down below 50 million, especially when it's in the continent of Africa and Asia and in very, very poor areas that are very crowded. I mean, I'm just not quite sure how. We in the West cannot give the money, we cannot send the personnel to help these people out in the mega slums of Africa and Asia. We can't. We can't supply our own staff with N95s when they want them, right? So it's going to be a tough time for everybody. So it's good news of recycling, it's bad news it didn't start collecting a month ago when we had tons. It's still needs to have some correlation here with what's going down on the ground. When people are having mass fit testing done, they need to be told to keep their own mask and reuse them instead of throwing them in the garbage. Patients need to be aware of the fact that they need to be nursed by people that know what they're doing. It's okay bringing in retired nurses, but if we don't have proper PPE for them, they're going to get infected. They're at a risky age group. So I'm not really convinced a lot of that's necessary. I think what is necessary is use those retired nurses and doctors and pharmacists and paramedics and fire services and police, use them in non-patiented areas, but more, let's get some community focus going. Let's get community task force going so our communities are safe. So neighbours know who their neighbours are. It's kind of been encouraged informally. It needs to be as formal as it was in the First World War during Spanish flu. We need to take responsibility for our neighbours, and we need to take responsibility for each other, and we need them to look after us. So my angry rants become this, and I will be a little bit more careful, Fiona and Kitty, about what I do say and how I say it online. But I still think it's an important thing to tell people the truth. The hospital did specifically say that they wanted communication to be open and transparent at the beginning of this. I'm not quite sure if they're still sticking to that, but they haven't sent me an email saying that they want it to be closed and secretive. But until such time, I will continue to do what I can do. I will be kind of careful. I was quite annoyed because the idea of removing all N95s and having people electronically sign one out a shift only if they were doing aerosol generating procedures and storing them in a paper bag was patently dangerous, really, really dangerous. They should never have reached circulation. That somebody should have said to that person, okay, what position that person is in the hierarchy. Somebody said no. And that happened a few hours after they told us that's what we were doing. So, as I said, any barrier to staff to take an N95 is going to kill staff. No barriers. Everybody's aware of the issues. Nobody's going to waste these masks whatsoever. And people are going to really, really conserve them. But I would like to see the recycling program up and running. I'd like to see us have careful looks at all use of N95s from everywhere in the local community. Like, is there anywhere in the local community that's using N95s that we could recycle? We've asked the construction industry if they have spare to send us them. Are they still throwing them out? Not all construction uses, some of it are chemical, would be amenable to reuse, but some of them might be. Dentists, vets, etc. It's okay asking for their spare supplies. Nobody has any because you can't buy them for love nor money. Like, what about their waste? If they're still wasting it, could we set up collection bins? Could they set up collection bins for us and deliver it? Again, that's a risk, right? I mean, it's going to be a risk, and we have to take risks in a condition of war to actually win battles. To actually say, no, we're not doing that because it's unsafe, and then put people at higher risk is worse. Like, not feeding staff, not making staff feel that the community loves them is a bad idea. This was a very snow-covered Bull Terrier production, 2020.